Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. Coming up on today's program, DPRK leader Kim Jong Un is back in Beijing for an official visit on the heels of his meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump in Singapore, a sign that denuclearization efforts are right on track. China vows to match any additional tariffs the U.S. will raise beyond the 25% duty on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. Could the battle over tariffs escalate? Let's begin our program today. We begin our program in Beijing. DPRK leader Kim Jong Un is in the Chinese capital for a two-day official visit. This is Kim's third trip to China over the past few months, only a week after the historic summit between him and U.S. President Donald Trump in Singapore. Take a look at the latest.
A third meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the DPRK leader Kim Jong Un. All three within the past 3 months. A week ago, the DPRK leader shook hands with the U.S. President Donald Trump in Singapore, the first time the leaders of the two countries did after the Korean War. In a joint statement, the DPRK and the U.S. have agreed to establish new relations in accordance with the desire of the peoples of the two countries. They are committed to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. Besides the symbolic significance of the summit, Mr. Trump sees his relations with Kim Jong Un as more important than the joint statement.
More importantly than the document, I have a good relationship with Kim Jong Un. That's a very important thing. I can now call him. I can now say, well, we have a problem. I told him, I gave him a very direct number. He can now call me if he has any difficulty. I can call him. We have communication. It's a very good thing.
Other members of the six-party talks also welcomed the positive outcome. Russian President Vladimir Putin invited Kim to visit Russia in September. Mr. Putin said he welcomed the meetings between the DPRK leader and Mr. Trump. Last week, Russia called for the easing of sanctions imposed on the DPRK after Pyongyang agreed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. South Korea and the U.S. have decided to suspend their joint military drills in August. South Korea said the suspension is meant to contribute to maintaining the positive momentum. Seoul also said there has been no decision made on any other joint exercises. Mr. Trump pledged to end war games with South Korea after his meeting with Kim. The U.S. president described the exercises as provocative and expensive.
For more about the future of the Korean Peninsula, with us in Beijing studio, Zhao Tong, who is a fellow with the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy here in Beijing. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Medford, we have Sun Young Lee, Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. Welcome, Professor. In Buffalo, U.S., we have Dennis Welder, who is an Assistant Professor of Practice in Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. He also former Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for East Asian Affairs, National Security Council under the administration, George W. Bush. Welcome to the three of you. I want to start with our Chinese guest. The DPRK leader Kim Jong Un is visiting China, two-day official visit, and the news of his coming over to China is released before he came to the country. That is a rare practice if you look at his previous trips. What does it say?
Well, I think one of the messages sent was, now look, even though North Korea is now in a different place, North Korea wants to build good relations with the United States, but North Korea still sees China as the most trustworthy partner, still relies very much on China for cooperation and support in the future negotiations of the denuclearization process and peace regime of the Korean Peninsula. So I think that's a proof that some previous concern that China might be marginalized in this process, that concern was very much misplaced.
Okay.
And also Kim Jong Un showed his confidence, right? He is willing to review the news of his foreign visit. Apparently, he's now concerned about domestic instability back at home. He feels very confident. He has fully consolidated power domestically in North Korea, and also, I think he is looking at the international stage.
I see.
He wants to present the image of a leader of a normal country. He's going to have many more international visits in the future. So all those visits will happen in a normal manner, just like any other top-level state visits.
Mr. Wilder, according to the press release by the two sides, DPRK and China, after the meeting between the leaders just now, 2 hours ago, they indicated that there are 3 supports China will continue to provide to the DPRK. One is about the deepening and the development of the relationship, bilateral relations, China-DPRK. Second, the friendship between the two peoples, Chinese people and people in DPRK, as well as China's support socialist DPRK. What are the messages as the American side would read out of this?
Well, I think the American side is watching this relationship develop very closely because one of the things that the president needs to have China do is continue the maximum pressure on North Korea until we get some real movement on a comprehensive, verifiable disarmament program. Now, it's clear that Kim is looking for economic development assistance from the Chinese, and of course the United States is willing to have that go forward. But if it moves out ahead of the denuclearization process, that's going to be a concern in Washington.
All right. Maximum pressure. Well, probably we need to look at that word in a new way now, since the DPRK-U.S. summit already took place, and the two sides have a joint statement. In that statement, they both talk about denuclearization and also about their own bilateral relations, by the way. So, Professor Lee, help us to understand here. The South Korean side stated very clearly that it supports the scrap off of the joint military exercises between South Korea and the United States in the month of August to create the appropriate condition and atmosphere for future process of negotiations. Meanwhile, South Korea and China share what the South Korean Foreign Ministry spokesperson said very clearly, strategic common goal, that is denuclearization, complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So, Professor Lee, how should we understand where South Korea stands and the so-called maximum pressure now?
Well, South Korea is very much pro-engagement, even at the cost of suspending the combined annual military exercises with the United States that have been going on in various forms since 1976. So my first point is these exercises are nothing new. They're not a novel threat to North Korea, although understandably North Korea every year objects to these exercises. I think President Trump, as he himself has said, unprompted, unilaterally giving this concession to North Korea, the suspension of the exercises, has set an unfortunate precedent, which is that President Trump is malleable, that these exercises are expendable. They're not essential to the alliance or to keeping the peace and prosperity, security in the region. These exercises have real-life implications, readiness for combat. They have implications for U.S. credibility in terms of a trusted ally with respect to other allies all over the world. So this is a pretty big concession, and I think it was gratuitous. It was not necessary because when you think about CVID, comprehensive, complete, irreversible, verifiable, dismantlement of nuclear weapons. It's not denuclearization, which creates ambiguity. Who's denuclearization? But originally conceived, CVID, the D is dismantlement of existing nukes, which are North Korean.
Complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula not only means the denuclearization of the DPRK that is having right now its nukes, but also the nuclearization and the measures taken by the United States, for example, with South Korea, so-called to prevent nuclearization. It is all included according to many of the debates and discussion we have earlier with all sides. So obviously, Mr. Zhao, there is a much more comprehensive picture. That is, you not only denuclearize, but also you provide a peace, stability environment for all possible efforts being made to denuclearize along the way. Mr. Zhao.
Yeah, I fully agree. Denuclearization of Korean Peninsula means not only North Korea has the responsibility to dismantle its nuclear weapons in the future, but U.S. and South Korea also have a responsibility to provide security assurance to North Korea, to reassure North Korea that
security guarantee.
Right. Yes. To guarantee North Korea that U.S. would not introduce nuclear-capable military platforms into the Korean Peninsula or to places near the Korean Peninsula, such as the strategic bombers, nuclear submarines, etc. So, given North Korea has made some substantive steps towards freezing its program, it would make sense for U.S. and South Korea to make some reciprocal concessions. Compared with other measures, like withdrawing troops from South Korea or changing the nature of U.S.-South Korean alliance relationship, suspending the joint exercises is the lowest cost price that the U.S. and South Korea can pay. So, and that's also an easily reversible step. If something happened, they can easily resume those exercises. So I think that's something U.S. and South Korea should seriously consider. We are going to face real pushback from the two militaries, from the conservative forces in the two countries. But I think that's a reasonable price for U.S. and South Korea to pay.
Another issue, of course, is about sanctions. Mr. Wilder, I'm sure you have heard about the debate of particularly unilateral sanctions. Well, just to explain to our viewers what exactly the sanctions are about, the sanctions that could be imposed by the United Nations, and that has been the sanctions that everybody has been agreed to. However, there are also sanctions that have been imposed unilaterally, for example, by the United States, and that's the sanction, Mr. Wilder. According to the Russian side, they would like the United States to stop. And meanwhile, there have also been others coming from the earlier parties of the six-party talks suggesting the U.S. should give a second thought to it right now. What do you think might be the response coming from Washington?
Well, first of all, I agree with Zhao Tung that the step the United States and South Korea made on suspending the exercises was a good step. I am not too concerned about this because it's easily reversible. What I'd like to see next, and the South Koreans have asked for this, is perhaps another step by the North Koreans to lower the number of artillery pieces along the DMZ, to take some steps to show that it is willing to de-escalate. I think if those steps were taken, then I think we could think about pulling back some of the sanctions. But until there are real, concrete steps taken by the North Koreans, we have right now just a vague statement. We don't have anything other than the shutting down of the nuclear test site.
May I ask you, Mr.
Wilder,
just to clarify, when you say if the DPRK is taking actions of, let's just say, reduce some of the numbers of armament along the DMZ, then we could, in a way, take away the sanctions. We meaning the United States, right? Because it is only the United States that is giving unilateral sanctions in the most severe way.
Well, I think that China also has put on some unilateral sanctions. For example, the amount of refined petroleum going to North Korea has been near zero for the last 6 months.
Okay, Mr. Zhao, did China put on unilateral sanctions? We have to make this very clear. Did China unilaterally put on sanctions on DPRK?
I'm not sure about that. I think the United Nations Security Council resolution put an annual quota of refined oil that North Korea can import. Sometimes foreign analysts only looking at the data for the first few months of Chinese export of refined oil products to North Korea, and then predict now, China is actually implementing the sanctions to a greater level than it is required by the resolution. But in fact, if we wait until the whole year and look at the entire data of 12 months, maybe, China isn't really imposing any unilateral sanctions on North Korea.
Okay, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Geng Shuang today also reiterated that China will comply to the UN sanctions that is still there against the DPRK. Having said that, though, let me move on to another issue with you, Mr. Wilder, just to make it clear. What does that mean? About this step-by-step thing? Mr. Wilder, you are the one who served in the George W. administration. At that time, I was a Washington correspondent. We both remember very clearly the six-party talks, the different rounds, 6 rounds of them altogether.
Right.
And the significant steps they took over those rounds is to have a timetable about step-by-step what different sides would commit and what different sides would do. And therefore, they know how things would move to the next step. But now, Mr. Wilder, we have actually no 6 parties sitting together, but we have to come up with a plan that the 6 parties, probably even more parties, have to agree upon. That's the challenge, isn't it, Mr. Wilder?
Yes, but I think we're on the right road. I want to be optimistic about this. I think the momentum is there for these talks. I think China and the United States are working well together on this. Secretary Pompeo said in Detroit yesterday that he's planning another trip out to North Korea at some point here. There's talk that perhaps Kim would come to the UN General Assembly in the fall. During this time period, I think they're going to be working on exactly what you're talking about, which will be how do we implement sequence steps that get us down the road to the denuclearization of the peninsula and to a peace treaty on the peninsula, because that's part of the goal as well. So I think Mr. Pompeo has the con on the American side. He will go to North Korea again soon. His negotiators will work out the details. I am optimistic that we are on the right road.
Right. Professor Lee, are you optimistic? You seem to be a bit skeptical by tradition, but what do you think, Professor Lee, about the step-by-step plan that all sides could work on with the new momentum?
Oh, I'm very optimistic for Kim Jong Un. He'll get more and more concessions from all sides, I'm sure. The last time the U.S. and South Korea suspended these exercises was back in the mid-90s, 94, 95, 96, as a goodwill gesture in the wake of the agreed framework in Geneva, October 1994. What happened then? Well, North Korea got each year from the U.S. about $100 million worth of food and fuel aid. North Korea got from the United States 500 million tons of heavy fuel oil. The United States did get a freeze on plutonium reprocessing, which is certainly not insignificant, but also denialism set in as more and more evidence came up that North Korea was cheating and pursuing an alternate line of bomb making through enriching uranium. South Korea got hit with the bill for the light water reactors.
So you're saying?
This kind of process of I'm saying North Korea will get more money and time from the U.S., from South Korea, certainly from China, and possibly from Japan. So you see how Kim Jong Un has not only reset the table and effected a dramatic image makeover, but in now being outgoing. This is how a neighborhood prowling recluse is transformed into a globe-trotting statesman. And we have seen this before. In May, June, July 2000, Kim Jong Un met with the leaders of China, South Korea,
every scene of it,
Russia.
Because we have been talking about the skepticism about whether all sides will implement what they have promised. And the earlier breakdown of the 6-party talks is a reflection of some sides not implementing at all their promises. There are different views as to who actually started it and who actually wrapped it up without really doing it. Well, that's history. But for now, 10, 15 years already passed. Are we going to recreate once again this momentum? Mr. Zhao, what do you think will be the next step if there is going to be any roadmap? And what would be the role of China, since we are asking a Chinese guest?
Well, I think given the U.S. and North Korea reached some very basic symbolic common views on the core issue of denuclearization, the logical next step is to end the status of war, to replace the existing Armistice Treaty with a new peace treaty, to have a new peace regime over the Korean Peninsula. And it would make sense for all four parties, U.S., two Koreas, and China, to participate in this process and to have a real negotiation about having a new peace treaty. There are many substantive issues to negotiate about. How to replace the United Nations command, how to do with the neutral nations supervisory commission, etc. How to draw the border, draw the maritime border between the two Koreas over the West Sea. Those negotiations will take time. In this process, I think it will be beneficial for North Korea to continue making concessions in the technical and operational level negotiations with the United States on limiting its nuclear missile programs.
Mr. Zhao, before we go, I do want to invite your views once again about what would the bilateral relations Pyongyang creates with the other parties of the earlier six-party talks, meaning his neighbors and those across the Pacific, the United States, for example. What would those bilateral relationships eventually settle in to the overall negotiation process? Mr. Zhao.
I think Kim Jong Un, together with his sister, are sincere in pivoting North Korea to a new course of focusing on domestic economic development. And for that to happen, they need good external environment. So to achieve that, they have this long-term goal, a strategic goal, to develop stable relations with all major powers in this region: China, South Korea, Russia, United States. Especially for U.S.-North Korea bilateral relationship, I think President Trump made the right decision to agree to gradually improve relations with North Korea, even though North Korea has been very hesitate about immediate denuclearization. Improving bilateral relationship with North Korea helps address the root cause of North Korea's paranoia. North Korea's sense of security is very much generated because of hostile relationship with the United States. So improving political relations with North Korea is the most effective way to address that problem. And it's also important for other countries to improve bilateral relations. Helping North Korea focus on economic development and conduct this transformation to a more normal and a more open country in the long run can make North Korea more rational, less paranoid, less obsessed with nuclear weapons. That's the best way to achieve denuclearization.
We are running out of time, Mr. Zhao. Certainly you have a lot in your mind to speak out about. But before we go, we do want to brief our viewers as well. During the bilateral discussions between Chinese leader and also the DPRK leader, China has been encouraging the DPRK to continue its path for economic development and also the improvement of the livelihood of its people. Those two roles have been stated by the DPRK, a Labour Party Congress. Having said that, though, we have to wrap it up for today. I'm sure the discussion will continue as situations evolve over the days, weeks, and months. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the three of you, for being with us. Zhao Tong, Sanyong Lee, Dennis Wilder. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And you are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China is not taking any additional U.S. tariffs, sitting down, vowing to retaliate in equal measure for any new duty. How worse can the exchange of tariffs get? We'll ask our panelists right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Let's move on to the latest in trade tensions between China and the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump threatened on Monday to raise more than tariffs on $200 billion U.S. worth of Chinese goods with a 10% duty. In response, the spokesperson of the Chinese Ministry of Commerce said Tuesday that China will be forced to adopt comprehensive measures combining quantitative and qualitative ones as retaliation if the U.S. side did lose its rationality and imposed additional tariffs. On Friday, the White House has already announced a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods, which prompted China to levy duties of equal value on American goods. The tariffs by both countries will take effect starting July the 6th. Meanwhile, China and the U.S. already had several rounds of trade talks in the past 3 months. Last month, Chinese President Xi Jinping's special envoy, Vice Premier Liu He, met with U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House. The visit led to a joint statement to drop tit-for-tat duties and fix economic issues through negotiations. On June the 2nd, U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross went to Beijing to hammer out details outlined in the joint statement. However, 2 weeks later, the Trump administration's flip-flop ran counter to the consensus the two sides reached, bringing the world's two largest economies closer to an all-out, possibly trade war. For more on trade tensions between China and the United States, let's loop in our very strong panel. With us in Beijing, we have Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center of International Business and Economics with the University of International Business and Economics in Washington, D.C. We have Douglas Paul, the Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in New York. We have Professor Max Wolf, a Professor of Economics from New School University. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the three of you. Things are developing very fast. Mr. Paul, I do want to address you with the very first question. Does threat, you think, gonna work for U.S.-China trade negotiations? Or from now on, there's not going to be any negotiations anymore, only shouting to one another?
It depends on your perspective. My view is that this cannot work, that the U.S. is putting on demands that are internally contradictory and therefore will defeat themselves. But clearly, since May 22nd, President Trump has decided that the U.S. is strong economically, is ready to withstand the temporary pain of going through a process of bringing China to the table on American terms. This has been reinforced, I think, by what he believes was a success in Singapore and talking to North Korea, and therefore they feel the U.S. has got an overwhelmingly upper hand with China and will keep raising the pressure on China until the U.S. is satisfied that China will open its markets and change its trading practices while increasing purchases of American exports.
Professor Liu, China is not at all, it seems, to link the DPRK issue with what is going on between the bilateral trade issue, China and United States. Having said that, though, China did respond to the U.S. decision to impose also $50 billion extra tariffs on the U.S. imports to China. And now, this time, the threat coming from the White House suggesting $200 billion. Where do you think things will go, understanding the Chinese logic?
Well, from the U.S. Donald Trump's perspective, number one, China has taken unfair advantage of the United States, particularly in terms of technology.
You don't have to repeat that because our American guest already said that. So what about the Chinese view? What is likely to be the Chinese logic approaching the subject?
China says, okay, if you accuse China of taking unfair advantage or stolen technology, bring up cases by cases. Do not just have a blanket accusation over China. So, and also there are dispute settlement mechanisms within WTO. Go for it. So you cannot unilaterally decide, well, China has stolen, and also, China is there to deserve such sort of punishment. So the other way is that, okay, by working together, through 3 rounds of talks, we are almost there to move forward by making compromises and by identifying the common goal, stepping up protection over intellectual property issue, enlarge imports, etc. So we are already on the track. But this flip-flop totally changed the course and create a total confusion, not only within the 2 states, but with all investors across the globe.
And anger as well. If you look at the stock markets all over the world today, certainly there's going to be disability, that is the thing that people worry the most in the business community. Having
Right.
said that, though, Professor Wolf, what about the measures and also the negotiations? Will those results still valuable at all? We all understand this is a transactional president that you have in the White House right now for the United States, but even though it could be transactional, but there are things that people want to achieve through negotiation. Otherwise, we should just throw negotiation out of the table, or rather out of the window.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think we sort of have a very complicated situation here. It looks like the Congress is making its own negotiation and deliberation, separate and apart from the president, and his basic style and forward motion here is a combination of bluster and personal promotion and a short-term view of his political needs. On the other side, we see the global community, led in this particular instance by Chinese authorities, trying to figure out how to safeguard a global system of prosperity, production, and distribution. And so we almost have a situation where even when folks are sitting around a table, they're not really speaking to each other on the same time frame, short-term for Trump, long-term for China and their other global trade players, and what people are trying to maximize is not really the same thing. So I think we need to keep talking, but it's hard to be super optimistic in the short term about the ability of those talks to achieve what we need to achieve.
Right. Mr. Paul, timing is always important. That's true for every negotiation. That's particularly true if you look at the political seasons in any country. So what about that timing thing? I mean, now you see the timing is about so-called the July the 6th, U.S. is going to implement the $50 billion US tariffs. Chinese side also give out the list without necessarily give the timing. You also see the U.S. side suggesting $200 billion without giving the timing, because there at least has to be a grace moment in which the public opinions will be solicited. How do you look at the issue of timing here?
Well, Tianwei, I think it was not the timing that you have mentioned, but the timing of the November elections for the midterm congressional elections that I think Professor Wald was implying in terms of short-term calculations. The upset in trade relations with China is paralleling the upset with the G7 when Trump stormed out of the Quebec meetings just before he went to Singapore and brought up cheese, which one has to assume is all about Wisconsin and the voters there getting a better shake out of the trade relationship with Canada in the mind of Trump. And then we've had disruption with the Europeans and with China over automobile tariffs. Presumably he's bidding to get the voters in Michigan, a traditional Democratic state, to vote for his candidates in November as well.
Given the timing, Professor Liu, what can China do? But on the other hand, the people could also say, maybe short term it is about that, but what about the long term? Is this a time to take a look at the bilateral relations as a whole?
Well, China is really reactive to the uncertainties that is really created by the Trump administration. So therefore, China is prepared for different alternatives. If we go along with the escalation for the trade tension, so China said, okay, we have quantitative and we also have qualitative measures to, with all the aces in the sleeves. And okay, China still would opt for the first choice, which is really, to keep the door open for joint dialogue and bring up constructive solutions so that, this bomb of trade war can be effectively diffused. So China still holds on that path, but we are also prepared for the worst.
Professor Wolf, there's a genuine question that I really need to ask. Every one of you probably have to answer that question too. That is, once the bilateral trade relations is going to the bottom, what can the two countries hold on to in terms of the future of the two largest economies, two of the most powerful countries in the world? Whose responsibility is it? Do we have a plan B if things are just going down all the time? Who will be responsible for the future, you know, that what we are creating right now, Professor Wolf?
So it's a great question. I think that the relations between the United States and China are really a question for 6.5 billion people, only a small minority of which live either in the United States, about 320 million, or the little over 1 billion people in China, right? So a small portion of the affected live in either country. So my hope is that the kind of cooler heads globally prevail. I think that we've seen some real leadership on the Chinese part. I think the problem with irrational and bluster-based basic international diplomacy, a la the Trump administration, is basically we keep punishing everyone for being reasonable who negotiates with us by being unreasonable. And the problem with that is we then become completely dependent on having the other side be as reasonable as we are unreasonable. And that is an untenable situation for anyone to be in, whether that's the rest of the G7 or somebody debating around NAFTA or Chinese trade delegations debates.
I see.
So my hope is that the American public and the global community comes in and takes us off a track that we're on, which is pretty frightening to me actually right now.
Professor Wolf, I have to say you got quite a tongue twister over there in the answer. But Mr. Paul, we certainly got the point. What about that? Who do you think should be responsible if things are really going downward all the time about bilateral trade, bilateral relations, and the global trading system? Who's going to be responsible for that?
Well, anytime in the last 40 years I could have named the people or identified the groups that would have taken responsibility to make sure that our relationship stays more productive than counterproductive. I can't name or identify a group today in the United States. People have been overwhelmed by a sense of outrage and frustration with China. China's more assertive behavior of the last 5 years has accumulated a record that in the U.S. people say there's no dealing with them until we delink our economies. Now, I think the other panelists would agree with me that delinking the U.S. and China's economy is, at this point, an impossibility. But it's seen as a political real choice here in Washington. And the people who are pushing that are very vocal, and the people who are skeptical about it are being cowed into not saying much, to being politically correct and keeping their heads down out of the line of fire. So right now it's an open field for those who want to be most aggressive, whether it's in technology transfer, trade relations, security cooperation, all of these areas that have been part of the substructure of the U.S.-China relationship.
Professor Liu, who will be responsible for that? Responsible for the bilateral trade relations, responsible for the bilateral relations, and responsible for the international trading trade systems. Professor Liu, also about timing, since we asked the timing issue to the U.S. guests, I should also ask the timing to the Chinese guests as well. That is, China is now celebrating 40 years of reform and opening up. And there's a lot of timing about what inspiration should China draw from the past experiences. So, Professor Liu, can we combine maybe those two questions together for you to provide some answers?
Well, I think now when the miscommunication and distrust is involved, you know, all parties involved bears at least a portion of the blame. So right now, China actually was thankful by, bringing China, or at least supporting China into the world trading system on the part of the United States. And China has been, while China has been spearheading into the upgrading of its industrial structure, now it seems that the White House is getting increasingly uncomfortable about this one. But China, time and again, assured the United States we're not fighting for the fixed share of the global marketplace, but rather, we can really work together. We have 1,000 reasons to work together, but it seems that Donald Trump is turning a deaf ear.
Right.
So therefore, if you say who is more responsible, who has really started this whole thing in the first place? So I think the world is very clear about this issue.
Okay.
So I think the solution is that both sides go back to ration and visit the basics of economics. So these two biggest economies by trading and on a fair ground, so the whole world will gain.
Well, talking about that, it's interesting because the U.S. side has also been talking about the next steps, the $200 billion. That's going to be a gigantic number, and meanwhile, that's going to be also influence having an impact on the operation and certainly on the success of the American multilateral companies, multinational companies in China. For example, according to some of the latest figures, 60% of China's exports to the United States are actually coming partly or directly coming from multinational companies that are headquarters actually in the United States. So we see a very intertwined picture over there. So Mr. Paul, are we going to see more casualties before any rational actions be taken?
I think that's the aim of the Trump administration, is to inflict casualties, and they think that when the casualty count takes place, there will be more Chinese casualties than American, and therefore China will yield to American pressure. This is a very risky calculation. Now, you've just mentioned the multinational companies, the American invested firms that produce in China, but there's a part of this that gets overlooked entirely, which is the very large American pension funds and large investing funds that take 401ks of ordinary American workers and have invested in companies that people think are Chinese companies, like Alibaba and Ant and WeChat and JD.com. And these people will all be affected if these industries are hurt by the trade conflict.
I see. So it seems that the list of mutual casualties could continue, as all of you have beautifully illustrated. We'll see how the political leaders will have the wisdom to solve the issue. We hope they do. Liu Baocheng, Douglas Paul, Max Wolf, what a pleasure to have all of you on our program. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.